London is supposed to be the centre of everything. The Thames, the Tower, the Old Bailey, a city that has absorbed 2,000 years of history into its streets and carried on regardless. For the people in this list, London became something else entirely. It became a city where a sailor lodged at a Wapping pub and left 7 people without their lives across 2 households in 12 days, and where the only man ever accused hanged himself before a courtroom could test the evidence. A city where a husband and wife buried their dinner guest under the kitchen flagstones and sat down to finish the meal. A city where a doctor dismembered his wife in a Holloway cellar and nearly crossed an ocean before a ship's captain sent a wireless telegram. A city where a young man staged an entire farmhouse massacre to look like his sister had done it. A city where a gang took 5 members of a single family, 2 of them infants, because they needed the father's freight company. Today we are covering London's most notorious family massacres and the cases that define the city's darkest recorded history. Section 1. The night Wapping stopped breathing entirely. At approximately 11:30 on the night of 7th December 1811, the servant girl Margaret Jewell returned to 29 Ratcliffe Highway in Wapping, East London, having been sent out by her employer Timothy Marr to buy oysters from a nearby store. The store was closed. She had been gone perhaps 20 minutes. When she knocked on the door of the linen draper's shop, nobody answered. She knocked again. A neighbour named John Murray heard the knocking and grew uneasy. He climbed a fence into the back of the property and entered through the rear. What he found inside ended whatever sense of safety the residents of Wapping still carried with them into their homes at night. Timothy Marr, 24 years old, lay near the shop counter. His skull had been shattered. His wife Celia, also 24, was found upstairs. Their apprentice, 14-year-old James Gowan, was in the shop. The 3-month-old infant, young Timothy, was in his cradle. His throat had been cut nearly to the point of decapitation. The shipwright's maul that had been used on the adults sat in the upstairs bedroom, close to the baby. The placement of it suggested the infant had been the last to lose his life that night. Margaret Jewell, who had heard the baby cry while she was still at the door, had survived only because Marr had sent her on that errand. 20 minutes was the margin between her life and what had happened to the rest of the household. Thames police officer Charles Horton arrived at the scene and recovered the maul from inside the property. A large chisel was found on the shop counter. 2 sets of footprints were visible at the rear of the premises, indicating more than one person may have entered. Within hours, 3 separate authorities were attempting to coordinate a response. The parish of St. George's in the east, the Shadwell Police Office, and the Thames River Police Office at Wapping. London in 1811 had no unified police force. The investigation was fragmented from the beginning. 12 days passed. On the night of December 19th, a lodger named John Turner was staying above the King's Arms Tavern on New Gravel Lane, roughly half a mile east along Ratcliffe Highway. He came downstairs during the night and, before reaching the ground floor, saw a figure standing over a body. He did not wait. He climbed back to his room, knotted his bedsheets into a makeshift rope, and lowered himself out of the window into the street, shouting for the watch as he went. Inside the tavern, John Williamson, 56, the landlord, had lost his life. His wife Elizabeth, 60, had lost hers. Their servant Bridget Anna Harrington, who was in her 50s, had not survived either. The Williamsons' 14-year-old granddaughter, Catherine Stilwell, was found in her bed upstairs, alive and entirely unaware of what had occurred below her. 7 people had lost their lives across 2 households in 12 days. The granddaughter's survival appeared to have been a matter of pure chance. The city did not respond with calm. Newspapers reported that fear had spread from the East End outward, reaching, as one account put it, from the Prince Regent's table at Carlton House to the lowest taproom in Wapping. Parliament convened emergency debate. Letters poured into the Home Office. The complete absence of any organised investigative body meant that reward money was offered in lieu of procedure, which produced a flood of unreliable tip-offs and little else. A suspect emerged within days. John Williams, approximately 27 years old, was a seaman who lodged at the Pear Tree Public House on Cinnamon Street, a short walk from both scenes. He had sailed previously with Timothy Marr. He had been seen in the area. His laundress, Mary Rice, testified that she had washed bloody clothing for him in the days following the Marr killings. Williams claimed a bar brawl had produced the blood. A fellow lodger reported that he had washed muddy stockings the morning after the Williamson killings. The maul recovered from the Marr scene was identified as belonging to a sailor named John Peterson, who also lodged at the Pear Tree and who had been at sea when the events took place. Peterson's trunk contained all his belongings except the maul. Williams had access to it. The circumstantial weight was significant but not conclusive. There was no confession, no direct witness placing Williams inside either property, and no physical evidence that met any rigorous standard. A carpenter named Cornelius Hart, who had worked at the Marr shop on the very day of the first incident, had left a chisel at the premises and later retrieved it from the scene, removing what may have been evidence. Hart's behaviour after Williams's arrest drew further scrutiny. Whether Williams acted alone, acted with others, or was a wrongly accused man who happened to be visible in the right places at the worst possible time has never been definitively resolved. The question became academic on December 28, 1811. Williams was found hanging in his cell at Coldbath Fields Prison, dead before any trial could take place. The authorities, under considerable public pressure to demonstrate that justice had been served, treated his death as a confession. On New Year's Eve 1811, his body was placed on an open cart alongside the alleged weapons and paraded through the streets of Wapping and Shadwell. An estimated 180,000 people lined the route. The procession halted at both murder scenes. At one point, the coachman reportedly struck the corpse 3 times with his whip. At the intersection of Cable Street and Cannon Street Road, a shallow grave had been dug in unconsecrated ground at the crossroads. Williams was lowered in. A stake was driven through his heart. He was the last person to receive that treatment in Great Britain. The strange quality of the whole affair is not the violence, which was extreme, but what followed it. A city that could not solve 2 household massacres committed 12 days apart, half a mile from each other, responded by staging a public spectacle around the body of a man who never stood trial. The maul, later identified as the key weapon, belonged to someone else entirely. 2 sets of footprints suggested more than one person. The case was never formally closed because it was never formally opened in any modern sense. What the Ratcliffe Highway events did produce, with a delay of 18 years, was the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 under Home Secretary Robert Peel. The failures of December 1811 became, in a roundabout way, the foundation of organised policing in London. The Pear Tree boarding house still stood for many years after the events. Williams's skull was reportedly dug up during construction work in 1886 and displayed behind the bar of a nearby pub. Whether that detail is true or apocryphal sits in the same unresolved space as everything else connected to the case. 7 people lost their lives across 2 households in the same half-mile stretch of East London, and the only man ever accused never faced a courtroom. The next case moves forward nearly 4 decades to a dining table in Bermondsey, where a husband and wife sat down to eat after burying their guest under the kitchen floor. Section 2. The dinner guest buried beneath the kitchen floor. On the evening of 9th August 1849, Patrick O'Connor arrived at 3 Miniver Place, Bermondsey, for dinner. He was 50 years old, an Irish customs gauger at the London docks, who had built a considerable fortune through money lending at high interest rates. He had been friends with Maria Manning for years, had been her lover before her marriage, and continued visiting the household afterward, with the apparent knowledge of her husband Frederick. He walked through the door that evening expecting a meal. The flagstone in the kitchen floor had already been lifted. The hole beneath it had already been dug. Maria Manning was born Maria de Roux in Lausanne, Switzerland, around 1821. She had come to England as a domestic servant and secured a position as lady's maid to Lady Blantyre, a close acquaintance of Queen Victoria. The position gave her a proximity to wealth she had no intention of surrendering. When she met both Patrick O'Connor and Frederick George Manning around the same period, she faced a calculation that shaped everything that followed. O'Connor was a man of substantial means but considerably older, a heavy drinker, and unwilling to commit to marriage. Frederick Manning, 30, worked as a railway guard on the Great Western Railway, earned a modest wage, and had none of O'Connor's financial standing. But he had made her a promise. He told her he was due to inherit a significant fortune from his mother. Maria chose Frederick. They married at St James's Church, Piccadilly, on 27th of May, 1847. The inheritance never materialised. What followed was a marriage held together less by affection than by shared calculation. Maria resumed her friendship with O'Connor after the wedding. Frederick appears to have tolerated it, perhaps because O'Connor occasionally dined with them, and the arrangement kept the possibility of access to his money alive. By 1849, the situation had shifted. O'Connor had changed his will in Maria's favour at some point, a fact she was aware of. The plan that emerged between husband and wife was straightforward in design and catastrophic in execution. They would invite O'Connor to dinner, take his life during the visit, bury him beneath the kitchen floor, and access his estate. When O'Connor stepped into the lower kitchen, Maria shot him in the back of the head with a pistol. The firearm was too small to produce a fatal result immediately. O'Connor went down, but did not lose his life at that moment. Frederick Manning retrieved a ripping chisel and finished the task. O'Connor was placed in the pre-dug hole beneath the flagstones. Quicklime was added to accelerate decomposition. The stones were replaced. The couple then sat down and ate the goose dinner Maria had prepared. That detail entered the reporting of the case and stayed there. The following morning, Maria used O'Connor's keys, which she had removed from his person the night before, to gain entry to his lodgings at Greenwood Street off Mile End Road. She removed railway shares, bonds, cash, and 2 gold watches. Within days, O'Connor's colleagues at the docks began asking questions. He had not been seen. When 2 of them visited Miniver Place and made inquiries, the Mannings panicked and fled the city separately. Maria was arrested in Edinburgh on 21st August 1849. Frederick was found in a village near St Helier in Jersey. Neither had managed to convert O'Connor's securities into usable funds quickly enough to disappear effectively. When police searched 3 Miniver Place, a detective noticed that one corner of the kitchen floor appeared disturbed, the stone sitting unevenly in soft earth. O'Connor's decomposing remains were found beneath it, alongside Maria's blood-stained dress. The trial took place on 25th and 26th October 1849 at the Old Bailey. Frederick and Maria Manning sat in the dock and refused to look at each other. Each placed the full weight of responsibility on the other. Frederick Manning later stated that he had found O'Connor still alive after the shooting and had struck him with the chisel because, in his own words, he had never much liked him. The jury required only 45 minutes to return guilty verdicts on both. Maria screamed at the jury that they had treated her like a wild beast of the forest. She then wrote to Queen Victoria, whom she had met during her years of service to Lady Blantyre, requesting a reprieve. The Queen studied the letter, according to contemporary accounts, and concluded that guilt had been established. The executions took place on the roof of Horsemonger Lane Gaol in Walworth on the 13th of November 1849. A crowd estimated at between 30,000 and 50,000 gathered below. At shortly after 9 in the morning, executioner William Calcraft withdrew the bolt. Frederick Manning died with little physical struggle. Maria writhed for several seconds. Their bodies remained hanging for the customary hour before being cut down and buried within the prison grounds. Maria wore black satin to her execution. The fashion press reported in subsequent months that black satin dresses had fallen sharply out of favour across the country, a trend attributed directly to the association with the case. Charles Dickens had secured a rooftop position nearby and watched the proceedings. His response was not fascination, but revulsion, directed not at the Mannings, but at the crowd below. He wrote to the Times condemning the atmosphere of festivity he observed, describing the levity and wickedness of the assembled mass as something no man could have imagined. He later returned to the case in his novel Bleak House, giving Maria Manning's qualities and contempt for her station to the character of Mademoiselle Hortense, a lady's maid who ends the novel by committing a murder. The transformation was barely concealed. The Bermondsey Horror, as newspapers had taken to calling it, was the first execution of a husband and wife to take place in England since 1700. What it demonstrated was something the Ratcliffe Highway case had also surfaced almost 4 decades earlier, that households in London could conceal extraordinary violence behind entirely ordinary fronts. A terraced house in Bermondsey, a dinner invitation, a kitchen floor. Before we move on, If you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Mannings carried out their plan with a pre-dug grave and a dinner table used as cover. The next case, set in North London in 1890, involved a woman who wheeled the evidence through the streets in a baby's pram, in plain sight, after dark. Section 3. Mary Piercy pushed the pram through North London after dark. At around 4 in the afternoon, on Friday 24th of October 1890, neighbours on Priory Street in Kentish Town, North London, heard screaming coming from inside number 2. They heard the sound of breaking glass. They heard what one account described as a violent struggle. Nobody intervened. By the time anyone entered the house, Mary Eleanor Piercy was alone inside, and the kitchen walls were covered in blood. Piercy was born Mary Eleanor Wheeler in Ightham, Kent, in 1866. She had taken the surname of a carpenter named John Charles Piercy, with whom she lived at Priory Street without marrying. He eventually left her because of her involvement with another man, a furniture remover named Frank Samuel Hogg. Hogg was not a straightforward figure. He had at least one other lover alongside Piercy, a woman named Phoebe Styles. When Styles became pregnant, it was Piercy herself who reportedly urged Hogg to marry her. He did. Phoebe Styles became Phoebe Hogg, delivered a daughter also named Phoebe but called Tiggy, and moved with her husband into lodgings in Kentish Town, a short distance from the house where his former companion continued to live, and where he continued, by all available evidence, to visit. The domestic geography of this arrangement was tightly wound. Piercy remained in close contact with the Hogg household. She had nursed Phoebe through an illness earlier in 1890. The two women maintained at least the outward appearance of friendship. By October of that year, Piercy sent a note to Phoebe inviting her to Priory Street for afternoon tea on the Friday. Phoebe Hogg, 31 years old, arrived with Tiggy, 18 months old, in the black perambulator at some point between 4 and 4:15 that afternoon. Neighbours heard what they heard at approximately that time. No record survives of precisely what took place inside the kitchen. What the police found when they searched the house 3 days later was considerable. Blood was spattered across the walls and ceiling of the kitchen. The fireplace poker carried traces of blood and matted hair. A carving knife showed the same. A skirt and apron belonging to Piercy had been heavily soiled. When Inspector Thomas Bannister of the Metropolitan Police's S Division put the poker and knife before Piercy and asked for an explanation, she told him she had been killing mice. She sat whistling quietly, showing no visible agitation. Bannister arrested her on 27th October 1890 and charged her with the willful killing of Phoebe Hogg and of the infant Phoebe Hogg. When he asked her to remove her gloves at the police station, he found she was wearing 2 wedding rings. One of them, a broad gold band, was later taken to the mortuary and confirmed to match the ring Frank Hogg had placed on his wife's finger. Phoebe Hogg's remains had been found on the evening of Friday 24th of October, discarded on a rubbish heap in Hampstead. Her skull had been crushed. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was very nearly detached from her body. Initial press reports speculated the individual was a sex worker, an assumption reflecting the period's habitual framing of unidentified female remains found in the street. Within hours, a black perambulator was located approximately 1 mile from the body, its interior cushions saturated with blood. The following day, Tiggy's body was found in Finchley. The infant had been smothered. Witnesses came forward to report that a woman had been seen pushing the pram through the streets of North London during the night of the 24th, after dark, at some distance from Priory Street. Mary Piercy's trial opened at the Old Bailey on 1st December 1890 and lasted 3 days. She maintained throughout that she was innocent and that the evidence had been misread or fabricated. The blood in her kitchen, she repeated, had come from her efforts to deal with mice. The jury did not accept this account. The verdict of guilty was returned. Piercy was sentenced to death and was transferred to Newgate Prison to await execution. The case generated press coverage of considerable scale. Madame Tussauds moved quickly after the conviction and purchased the blood-soaked perambulator along with the contents of Piercy's kitchen. When the resulting exhibit opened in the Chamber of Horrors, 30,000 people attended. The noose used in the execution was subsequently placed on display at Scotland Yard's Black Museum. There was something almost theatrical about the public appetite for the physical objects in this case, as though proximity to the pram or the poker could explain what had taken place in that kitchen. The execution was carried out by James Berry at Newgate Prison on December 23, 1890. Piercy was 24 years old. Berry later noted that in all his years as executioner, she remained the most composed individual he had encountered on the scaffold. She made a last-minute confession before the sentence was carried out. She did not name Frank Hogg as having any involvement. The precise content of what she said was not fully recorded in the public account. Frank Hogg was not charged with any offence. What the Hampstead case demonstrated, alongside its violence, was how much a woman could move through Victorian London at night while pushing a pram before anyone thought to ask why. The answer, in part, is that nobody was expected to. The domestic was invisible. Piercy understood that, or at least she acted as though she did, right up until the moment the walls of her kitchen told a different story entirely. The next case crosses forward 20 years to a quiet terraced house in Holloway, where a mild-mannered American doctor had been disposing of his wife in sections beneath the cellar floor, and had very nearly escaped across the Atlantic before a ship's captain sent a wireless telegram that changed everything. Section 4. The Doctor at 39 Hilldrop Crescent and the Cellar Below. On the morning of the 8th of July 1910, Chief Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard visited 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Holloway, North London, to ask a mild-mannered American doctor some questions about his missing wife. Crippen was cooperative, patient, and entirely plausible. He explained that Cora had left him for another man, that he had been embarrassed by this, and had told her friends she had died in America to avoid the shame of it. Dew found no immediate reason to doubt him. He thanked Crippen and left. When he returned to the house a few days later to follow up, Crippen was gone. Ethel Leneve was gone. The house was empty. Dew ordered a full search of the property. On July 13, 1910, working through the brick floor of the cellar, officers uncovered a quantity of decomposed human flesh wrapped in a pyjama jacket. There were no bones, there was no head, there were no hands. What remained had been treated with quicklime and buried under the cellar floor at some point months earlier. Hawley Harvey Crippen was born on September 11, 1862, in Coldwater, Michigan. He trained as a homeopath and moved to London in 1897 with his second wife, Corinne Henrietta Turner, who performed under the stage name Belle Elmore and harboured determined ambitions as a music hall singer. The ambitions outpaced the talent. The marriage was, by most accounts available from the period, an arrangement of mutual dissatisfaction. Cora Crippen was described by contemporaries as extravagant, loud, and openly unfaithful. Crippen was slight, soft-spoken, and absorbed in his work. In 1905, they took a lease on 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Holloway, a semi-detached Victorian villa where they took in lodgers to supplement Crippen's income from selling patent medicines. In 1906, he came home to find Cora in bed with one of the lodgers. He said nothing publicly. He had by that point already begun an affair with his secretary, a young woman named Ethel Leneve, whom he described in his letters as his wifey. Cora Crippen was last seen alive on the evening of January 31st, 1910, following a dinner party at Hilldrop Crescent. 2 weeks before that date, Crippen had purchased 5 grains of hyoscine hydrobromide from a pharmacist. Hyoscine is a depressant of the central nervous system. In the quantities Crippen obtained, it was capable of producing fatal respiratory failure. After Cora's disappearance, he told her friends she had gone back to America. In February 1910, he sent word that she had fallen ill in California and subsequently lost her life there. Meanwhile, Ethel Leneve moved into 39 Hilldrop Crescent and was seen in public wearing Cora's jewellery and furs. Friends of Cora's, several of whom were fellow members of the Music Hall Ladies' Guild, grew suspicious and contacted Scotland Yard. Their concerns were initially treated as insufficient grounds to investigate. The forensic examination of the remains found in the cellar identified a surgical scar on the flesh that matched a scar Cora Crippen was known to carry from an earlier operation. The pyjama jacket wrapped around the remains was traced to a manufacturer who confirmed the fabric had only been produced after 1905, placing it firmly within the period when the Crippens had lived at Hilldrop Crescent. Traces of hyoscine were identified in the tissue. An arrest warrant was issued on the 16th of July 1910. By then, Crippen had already been gone for several days. He had boarded the SS Montrose in Antwerp on the 20th of July 1910, travelling under the name Robinson and accompanied by Ethel Leneve, whose long hair had been cut short and who was dressed in a boy's suit and travelling as his son. Captain Henry Kendall of the SS Montrose observed the pair closely over several days at sea. He noted that the boy's suit fitted poorly and that the two passengers displayed an unusual degree of physical affection for what was supposed to be a father and son. On July 22, 1910, Kendall used the ship's wireless apparatus to send a message to the White Star Line in Liverpool. It was the first time wireless telegraphy had been used to track a criminal suspect. The message identified the fugitives. Scotland Yard received it the same day. Chief Inspector Dew boarded a faster vessel, the SS Laurentic, and crossed the Atlantic ahead of the Montrose. He was waiting at Father Point in the St. Lawrence River when the Montrose arrived. Crippen was arrested on July 31, 1910, still apparently unaware that his case had been running on the front pages of British newspapers for weeks. Ethel Leneve was arrested alongside him. The world press had been following the wireless messages in real time, which was itself a novelty. The pursuit generated public attention on a scale that the case would carry long afterward. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on October 18, 1910. The prosecution presented the hyoscine purchase, the identified scar, the dated pyjama fabric, and the circumstantial accumulation of Crippen's shifting explanations. The jury took less than 30 minutes to return a guilty verdict. Ethel Leneve, tried separately as an accessory, was acquitted. Crippen was sentenced to death. He declined to implicate Leneve in any statement made before his execution. On the morning of November 23, 1910, Hawley Harvey Crippen was hanged at Pentonville Prison in North London. He was 48 years old. The hangman, a Yorkshire barber named John Ellis, later recalled that Crippen had seemed pleasant company the day before and was smiling when the cap was placed over his head. His body was buried in the prison grounds. Ethel Leneve emigrated and eventually settled in South London, where she lived until 1967. The case was the most discussed British household killing of the 20th century for decades afterward. What made it persist was less the violence itself than the image of a quiet, precise man in a neat house in Holloway who had apparently done something extremely careful, then walked out the front door and tried to disappear across an ocean, only to be undone by a technology that had barely existed a decade earlier. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The doctor at Hilldrop Crescent calculated carefully and nearly vanished. The next case, set 75 years later at a farmhouse in Essex, involved a young man who staged an entire crime scene to make the family he had just taken the lives of look like they had done it to themselves. Section 5. Jeremy Bamber called the police before anyone found the bodies. At 3:26 in the morning on 7th August 1985, a call came into Chelmsford Police Station from a young man named Jeremy Bamber. He said he was at his home in Goldhanger, Essex, several miles away from his family's farmhouse. He told the operator that his father Neville had just telephoned him in a panic, saying that his sister Sheila had a gun and had gone berserk. Then, he said, the line had gone dead. Armed officers were dispatched to White House Farm near the village of Tolshunt Darcy. When they arrived, the house was dark and locked. They waited outside for several hours before forcing entry at around 5 in the morning. Inside they found 5 people, none of whom had survived the night. Neville Bamber, 61, was found in the kitchen. He had been shot 8 times. There were signs of a sustained physical struggle, including injuries consistent with having been struck repeatedly with the rifle itself. June Bamber, also 61, was in the master bedroom upstairs. She had been shot 7 times. The twin boys, Daniel and Nicholas Caffell, both 6 years old, were found in their beds in a separate room, each shot in the head at close range. Sheila Caffell, 28, was found on the floor of the master bedroom beside her mother. She had 2 gunshot wounds beneath the chin. A .22 caliber Anschutz semi-automatic rifle was positioned across her body. A Bible lay next to her. Her arms were outstretched. There were no defensive wounds on her hands. The initial reading of the scene by Essex police was that Sheila, who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia and had recently been discharged from a psychiatric unit, had shot her parents, her children, and then taken her own life. Jeremy Bamber, the only surviving member of the immediate family, was 24 years old. He had been born Jeremy Paul Marsham in Kensington, London, and adopted as an infant by Neville and June Bamber. He arrived at the farm after the police and was seen by officers in a state of distress. He attended all 5 funerals in the weeks that followed. The murder-suicide theory held for approximately 1 month. Then Jeremy's girlfriend Julie Mugford walked into a police station. She told officers that Jeremy had been planning the killings for more than a year. He had spoken of wanting his parents' estate, valued at around £436,000 at the time. He had discussed sedating them and burning the farmhouse down. He had discussed hiring someone to carry out the act. In the end, Mugford told police, he had done it himself. She said that on the night of 6th August, he had telephoned her in the early hours and whispered 2 words. "It's done." She also told officers that he had confided in her that Sheila's mental health history was the perfect cover because, in his framing of it, she was, as Mugford recalled him putting it, mad enough to have done something like this. The physical evidence that reshaped the case was the silencer. 3 days after the events, officers found the sound moderator for the rifle in a cupboard inside the farmhouse. Tests identified traces of June Bamber's blood and hair inside it. The prosecution's argument at trial was precise. With the silencer attached to the barrel, the rifle was long enough that Sheila Caffell, given the location of the entry wounds beneath her chin, could not have reached the trigger. Her injuries from the first shot would also have prevented her from removing the silencer, walking to the cupboard, placing it inside, returning, repositioning herself, and then firing a second round. The forensic logic was that the silencer had been removed from the weapon after the other 4 members of the household had lost their lives, and before the scene was arranged, to suggest that Sheila had been responsible. Jeremy Bamber was taken into custody on September 29, 1985. His trial opened at Chelmsford Crown Court in October 1986. The prosecution presented Mugford's testimony, the silencer evidence, the lack of gun oil on Sheila's nightdress, and a pattern of behaviour in the weeks following the events that included Jeremy selling his mother's jewellery and accessing the family finances. The defence argued that Sheila had carried out the act during a psychotic episode, and that Mugford's testimony was that of a woman with a personal motive to destroy him. The jury, by a majority of 10-2, found Jeremy Bamber guilty on all 5 counts. The sentencing judge described him as warped and evil beyond belief and imposed 5 life sentences with a recommended minimum of 25 years. In 1994, the Home Secretary informed Bamber that the minimum term had been removed and replaced with a whole life order. He would never be released. Jeremy Bamber has continued to contest his conviction from HM Prison Wakefield, where he remains. He has submitted multiple applications to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. All have been rejected. His lawyers have raised questions about a possible second silencer, about photographs of the crime scene, and about the burns found on Neville Bamber's back, which Bamber's legal team argues were caused by the kitchen Aga rather than by the rifle barrel, as the prosecution contended at trial. The Court of Appeal upheld the verdict in 2002. The High Court dismissed a further bid for evidence disclosure in 2020. What the White House farm case sits alongside, when you consider the pattern of it, is a particular category of household event in which the staging of the aftermath is as deliberate as the act itself. Neville Bamber had reportedly told his secretary in the days before his death that he had a sense something bad was coming. He had spoken of a premonition. Whether that detail belongs to the record or to the mythology that accumulates around cases of this scale is difficult to separate at this distance. What is verifiable is that 5 people lost their lives in a locked farmhouse in Essex on the night of 6th August 1985, and that the only person who knew to call the police before any of them were found was the one person who, according to the jury, had carried out the act. The next case moves forward 18 years and across London to Heston in the west of the city, where 5 members of a single family were taken from their home by a criminal gang who needed the father's freight company and had decided the simplest way to obtain it was to make the entire family disappear. Section 6. A freight company in Heston and the family who owned it. On 13th of February 2003, Amarjit Chauhan, 45, told his staff at CIBA Freight Services near Heathrow Airport that he was leaving to go and do a deal. He drove to a meeting arranged near Stonehenge in Wiltshire. He was not seen alive again. What his employees did not know, and what investigators would spend the following months reconstructing piece by piece, was that the meeting near Stonehenge had been a trap. Kenneth Regan, William Hornsey and Peter Rees had been waiting for him. Regan and his associates abducted Amarjit Chauhan and transported him to Regan's father's home in Forge Close, Wilton, near Salisbury, where he was bound, held, and forced under duress to sign sheets of blank paper. Those blank sheets would later be typed over to produce letters appearing to transfer ownership of CIBA Freight to Regan voluntarily. Amarjit Chauhan had been born in India and built his life in Britain. He owned Seba Freight Services, a company employing around 30 people with a turnover of up to £4 million annually, operating primarily in the import of fruit, vegetables, and other goods through Heathrow. He lived in Heston, West London, with his wife Nancy, 24, their two sons, Devinder, 18 months old, and Ravinder, 8 weeks old, and Nancy's mother, Charanjit Kaur, 51, who had travelled from India to visit. Kenneth Regan, born in 1953, was a former drug trafficker who had served prison time for his earlier offences. He had attached himself to CIBA Freight's orbit over several years and had been attempting to position himself for a takeover of the business. When the legitimate route failed to produce results, the operation shifted. The plan, as prosecutors later described it to the Old Bailey, had a logic that was also its most revealing feature. Amarjit Chauhan's disappearance alone would not hold. If he simply vanished while his family remained in Heston, questions would follow immediately. The prosecution summarised it directly. Those involved in the planning must have understood that Amarjit's disappearance would not seem credible if it appeared he had left his family behind. The family, therefore, could not be left behind. On February 15, 2003, while Peter Rees remained at the Wiltshire location guarding Amarjit Chauhan, Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey drove to London and talked their way into the family home in Heston. Nancy Chauhan, Devinder, Ravinder and Charanjit Kaur all lost their lives there that day. The two infant boys were 18 months old and 8 weeks old. The bodies were removed from London in a hired van and transported to Devon, where they were buried on land belonging to a 50-acre estate owned by Belinda Bruin, a former publicist with whom Regan had developed an obsession. Bruin had no knowledge of what had been placed on her property. Amarjit Chauhan had, during his captivity, managed to conceal a note on his person. The note referenced Regan's address in Salisbury. It was found during the forensic examination of his remains, hidden in his sock. The prosecution presented it as a deliberate attempt by Chauhan to leave a traceable connection to his abductor. For a man held, bound and coerced into signing documents he knew would be used against his own estate, it was a precise and deliberate act. On February 17, 2003, 2 days after the killings at the Heston house, Regan arrived at CIBA Freight Services, presenting a handwritten letter and a power of attorney, both purporting to be from Amarjit Chauhan, stating that he had decided to retire and hand over the business. The employees were immediately suspicious. Chauhan had given no prior indication of any such intention. Phone records obtained during the investigation showed that Amarjit Chauhan's mobile phone and Regan's mobile phone had been travelling together on the day of the abduction, tracking a route towards Salisbury. The investigation expanded across multiple agencies. On April 22, 2003, canoeists near Bournemouth Pier found a body floating in the sea. Decomposition made immediate identification impossible, but the remains were eventually confirmed as Amarjit Chauhan. The bodies of Nancy Chauhan and Charanjit Kaur were subsequently recovered from the English Channel. The remains of Devinder and Ravinder Chauhan, 8 weeks old and 18 months old, were never found. The breakthrough that accelerated the investigation came on 9 April 2003, when Belinda Bruin contacted police. She had become alarmed by Regan's behaviour on her estate and the unauthorised digging she had observed there. Traces of Amarjit Chauhan's blood were later identified on a speedboat used by the group to dispose of the bodies at sea. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in 2005 and became the longest trial in Metropolitan Police history. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey were convicted of all 5 killings and received whole life orders. Peter Rees was convicted of 1 and sentenced to 23 years. What the Chohan case demonstrated with unusual clarity was the internal logic of a particular type of criminal planning that accounts for its own loose ends as it proceeds. The family in Heston was not a spontaneous secondary act. It was built into the architecture of the original plan from the beginning. Regan had calculated that the disappearance of a successful businessman required the disappearance of the entire household around him to function without immediate scrutiny. The two infant boys, 8 weeks and 18 months old, were part of that calculation. Their bodies were never recovered. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Chohan case was driven entirely by financial calculation, a plan that treated 5 human lives as variables in a business takeover. The next case, set in a London park in the summer of 2020, involved a motive of an entirely different order, one that a court would later describe as a contract signed in the perpetrator's own blood with a demon in exchange for a lottery win. Section 7. 2 sisters in Friant Country Park on a June night. On the evening of June 5, 2020, Bibba Henry gathered a small group of friends in Friant Country Park in Wembley, northwest London, to celebrate her 46th birthday. Her younger sister Nicole Smallman, 27, was among them. The gathering was informal, held outdoors during the first summer of pandemic restrictions, when indoor socialising remained limited. At some point during the night, the group dispersed, and the 2 sisters stayed on alone in the park. They took photographs together with fairy lights in the darkness. The last images recovered from their phones showed them dancing. In those photographs, investigators later noted, the sisters appeared to glance sideways towards something at the edge of frame. Police believe that was the moment Daniel Hussein arrived. Hussein was 18 years old at the time of the act. He lived with his mother at Guy Barnett Grove in Blackheath, southeast London. He had been a quiet, internally focused young man with a long-standing interest in mythology, Satanism, and occult material. In October 2017, when he was 15, his school had referred him to the government's counter-extremism programme, PREVENT, after he was found accessing far-right and extremist material on school computers. He was placed on the Channel programme, the higher-tier strand of PREVENT reserved for the most concerning referrals, involving a multi-agency panel and a tailored support plan. The Channel programme discharged him in 2018. He was seen again at 6-month and 12-month follow-up intervals. Nothing in those follow-up contacts indicated the direction his thinking had taken. In the period leading up to June 2020, Hussein had been active on an occult online forum run by an American figure known as E.A. Coetting, whose platform had more than 85,000 YouTube subscribers at the time, and whose written material, as the BBC later reported, explicitly encouraged acts of violence in the context of ritual practice. Hussein had written and signed in his own blood a handwritten document pledging to sacrifice women at a rate of 6 every 6 months, addressed to a demonic entity named King Lucifuge Rofakal. In exchange for fulfilling the terms of the pledge, Hussein believed he would receive a lottery win. The specific prize he had identified was the Mega Millions Super Jackpot, which stood at £321 million at the relevant time. After carrying out the act in Friant Park, he purchased lottery tickets. Bibba Henry was stabbed 8 times. Nicole Smallman suffered 28 stab wounds and had, the prosecution told the Old Bailey, put up a very brave fight. After both women lost their lives, Hussein dragged their bodies into undergrowth and positioned them intertwined. Mrs. Justice Whipple, in her sentencing remarks, stated that this had been done to defile them in death. Their bodies were found on 7th of June 2020, 36 hours after they had been reported missing to police, by Nicole Smallman's boyfriend Adam Stone, who had organised a search when the family received no adequate response to their initial calls to the Metropolitan Police. Stone found them in the bushes and fell to his knees. Hussein was identified through DNA traces found at the scene and was taken into custody approximately 4 weeks after the act, on July 2nd, 2020. The handwritten pact was found during the search of his home. His trial opened at the Old Bailey in June 2021. Hussein declined to give evidence and denied both the killings and authorship of the document. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of possession of a bladed article. He was sentenced by Mrs. Justice Whipple on 28 October 2021 to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years. At sentencing, he sat with his back to the court, connected by video link from Belmarsh Prison. The case carried a secondary dimension that the victim's mother, the Venerable Mina Smallman, pursued with sustained determination. In the hours after the bodies were found, 2 Metropolitan Police constables, Denise Jaffa, 47, and Jamie Lewis, 33, had been assigned to guard the crime scene at Friant Country Park. During the early hours of the 8th of June, both officers left their posts and approached the bodies. Jaffa took 4 photographs on his personal mobile phone. Lewis took 2. Lewis then superimposed his own face onto one of the images and sent it to Jaffa. The photographs were subsequently circulated on WhatsApp to colleagues and, in some instances, members of the public. Lewis referred to the sisters in a message sent at 3:45 in the morning as 2 dead birds. Both officers pleaded guilty to misconduct in a public office at the Old Bailey. They were each sentenced to 33 months in custody in December 2021 and were dismissed from the Metropolitan Police. Their subsequent appeals against sentence were dismissed by the Court of Appeal. Mina Smallman, an archdeacon in the Church of England, spoke outside the Old Bailey after Hussein's sentencing and described him as a broken human being. She stated her belief that he would not be released when his minimum term expired. She also said that if he had not been caught, 4 other families might have been suffering what hers had endured. The pact had specified 6 women every 6 months. The online forum through which Hussein had deepened his engagement with occult material and, by the prosecution's account, refined the framework for what he intended to do, was removed from YouTube and Facebook following a BBC investigation in the weeks after sentencing. The next case moves forward 3 years to the summer of 2024 and to a house in Bushey, Hertfordshire, where a man armed with a compound crossbow crossed a threshold he had been locked out of 2 weeks earlier and did not leave until 3 members of the same family had lost their lives. Section 8, Ashling Close, Bushey, and the afternoon of July 9th, 2024. At 14:32 on the afternoon of July 9th, 2024, Kyle Clifford arrived at the Hunt family home on Ashling Close in Bushey, Hertfordshire. He was carrying a butcher's knife. He had a Horizon Cornet MXT 405 compound crossbow and duct tape in his car parked nearby. He told Carol Hunt, 61, that he had come to return belongings to her daughter Louise, his former girlfriend. Carol Hunt let him in. She had, as her husband John Hunt later told Cambridge Crown Court, shown Clifford compassion right until she answered the door. Clifford stabbed Carol Hunt to death inside the property. He then left the house, returned to his car, collected the crossbow, and went back inside. Clifford was born in Enfield, North London, in April 1998. He was a former soldier. He had been in a relationship with Louise Hunt, 25, for approximately 18 months. On June 26, 2024, Louise ended the relationship by text. Clifford's response to that message gave Louise the impression the separation had been accepted calmly. It had not. Over the following days, investigators would later establish Clifford made internet searches checking the movements of Louise's father, John Hunt, a BBC horse racing commentator. He purchased duct tape. He sourced the crossbow. The Crown Prosecution Service described the events of July 9th as a carefully planned attack. After taking Carol Hunt's life in the kitchen, Clifford waited inside the house. Louise had been working in her dog grooming pod in the garden. At 16:13, she entered the property. Clifford was waiting. He restrained her with duct tape and prevented her from leaving. What followed lasted nearly 3 hours. Clifford subjected Louise Hunt to a deeply harmful incident before later taking her life with the crossbow. He had also, during this period, used Louise's mobile phone to send a text message to her father asking what time he would be home. The inference drawn by the prosecution was that Clifford was checking whether John Hunt would arrive before he had finished. Hannah Hunt, 28, Louise's older sister, was returning from work. At 18:49, she called her mother's phone as she approached the house. There was no answer. She entered the property, called out, and went upstairs. She saw Clifford. She began shouting. At 18:52, Hannah sent a message to her boyfriend, Alex Klein, asking him to call police and telling him that Clifford was tying her up. Her phone was silenced. At 18:54, Clifford shot Hannah Hunt with the crossbow. He left the house immediately, the crossbow concealed under a blanket. John Hunt arrived home later that evening to find the aftermath. In his victim impact statement, he told the court that Hannah's decision to send that message to her boyfriend had saved his life, because he would have walked through the door before police arrived if she had not raised the alarm. He described it as the final act of his daughter, made in the last 2 minutes she was alive. A manhunt was launched by Hertfordshire Constabulary and the Beds, Herts and Bucks Major Crime Unit. Clifford was located the following day, July 10, 2024, in Lavender Hill Cemetery in Enfield, North London, in undergrowth. As armed police moved in, he shot himself in the chest with the crossbow. The injury left him paralysed from the waist down. He was taken initially to the Royal London Hospital before being transferred into custody. Clifford was charged on September 17, 2024, with 3 counts of murder, rape, false imprisonment, and 2 counts of possessing an offensive weapon. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. In January 2025, he changed his pleas to guilty on the murder counts, the false imprisonment charge, and the weapons charges, but continued to deny the rape of Louise Hunt. A trial on the rape charge proceeded at Cambridge Crown Court. The jury found him guilty. Clifford refused to attend the trial. He also refused to attend his sentencing hearing on March 11, 2025. Justice Joel Benathan sentenced Clifford in his absence, imposing 3 whole-life orders. In his sentencing remarks, he described Clifford as a jealous man soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. The Crown Prosecution Service statement, delivered by Senior Crown Prosecutor Lisa Kiff, noted that at every turn Clifford had attempted to escape the gravity of his actions, from seeking to evade arrest to refusing to attend his own trial and sentencing. Hertfordshire Constabulary's Detective Chief Inspector Nick Gardner of the BCH Major Crime Unit described the 3 women as vibrant individuals in the prime of their lives and acknowledged the immense dignity shown by the Hunt family throughout the proceedings. Amy Hunt, the sister and daughter who had not been present at the house that afternoon, addressed Clifford in her victim impact statement. She told him directly that she would have been his 4th individual that day. The case sat within a pattern of domestic-adjacent violence that had generated sustained national debate in the preceding years. Carol Hunt had opened her front door in the reasonable expectation that a young man she had previously welcomed into her family home was there to return her daughter's belongings. The planning that preceded that moment, the crossbow purchased, the duct tape bought, the digital checks on John Hunt's schedule, had been underway for almost a fortnight before she answered the door. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from Bushey to Luton in September 2024, where a 19-year-old turned a firearm on his mother, his brother, and his sister inside their family flat, and was then found walking toward his former primary school with the same weapon still on him. Section 9. Leabank Court, Luton, in the early hours of 13th of September 2024. At some point in the early hours of Friday 13th of September 2024, Nicholas Prosper, 19, took a shotgun from inside the flat at Leabank Court in the Marsh Farm area of Luton and went to his mother's bedroom. He had planned to carry out the act while the household slept. Juliana Falcon, 48, woke up. She attempted to take the firearm from her son. During the struggle, Prosper shot her in the head. He then went to find his 13-year-old sister, Giselle, who had been woken by the noise and was hiding in the living room. She did not survive. His 16-year-old brother Kyle ran to the kitchen. Prosper shot him in the chest and then stabbed him more than 100 times. A book titled How to Kill Your Family was found placed on Juliana Falcon's body after the act. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, a neighbour called 999 after hearing a loud bang and then knocking on the family's door and receiving no answer. Prosper was found by officers from Bedfordshire Police in nearby Bramingham Road shortly before 8 in the morning. A loaded shotgun was recovered from bushes close by, along with more than 30 cartridges. He was on his way to St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School. Nicholas Prosper had acquired the shotgun by producing a fraudulent firearms certificate. The purchase had taken place less than 24 hours before the act. Security footage showed him returning to the flat with the weapon concealed in a bag. The night before, investigators established, he had fired a test shot into a teddy bear inside the property. The planning documented in his devices and materials was extensive and specific. Prosper had developed a detailed written plan to take the lives of 34 people in total, his 3 family members, followed by children as young as 4 years old at St. Joseph's, 2 teachers, and finally, himself. He had been watching a substantial volume of violent online material and had developed what the sentencing judge described as a fixation on mass shooting events. His stated ambition, as Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb outlined at Luton Crown Court on March 19, 2025, was to be known posthumously as the world's most famous school shooter of the 21st century. Prosper had been described by those who knew him as a quiet, somewhat isolated young man. He had a small social circle during his school years and had subsequently dropped out of 6th form. His father, Raymond Prosper, who was the former partner of Juliana Falcon and the father of Giselle and Kyle, stated in his victim impact statement that Nicholas had completely isolated himself from the family over the preceding year and that none of them had any knowledge of what he had been planning. More than 200 indecent images of children were found on Prosper's devices during the investigation conducted by the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crime Unit. Prosper pleaded guilty in February 2025 to 3 counts of murder. He gave a no-comment interview to police following his arrest and maintained that posture throughout the investigation. At Luton Crown Court, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb sentenced him on March 19, 2025 to 3 life terms with a minimum of 49 years. She told him directly, "Your ambition was notoriety. You wanted to be known posthumously as the world's most famous school shooter of the 21st century. The lives of your own mother and your younger brother and sister were to be collateral damage on the way to fulfill that ambition." She considered imposing a full life order, but declined to do so, given that Prosper had been 18 at the time of the act and had entered guilty pleas. Bedfordshire Police's Detective Chief Inspector Sam Canner described the case as one of the most disturbing the unit had encountered. The judge paid explicit tribute to the 3 people who lost their lives that morning, noting that the noise of their resistance as they fought back had alerted the neighbour who contacted police. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb stated that Juliana Falcon, Kyle Prosper and Giselle Prosper's deaths were almost certain to have saved the lives of many children, and that the community owed them its gratitude. Their father Raymond echoed this in his statement, noting that what had at first appeared to be only a private family tragedy had ultimately carried a significance that extended far beyond the flat in Leebank Court. The structural detail of the case that sits outside the immediate violence is the forged firearms certificate. Prosper was 19 years old and living in a Luton tower block. He had no legal entitlement to own a firearm. He produced a fabricated document to obtain one from a licensed dealer less than a day before he used it. The transaction went through. That single point of procedural failure sat at the entrance of everything that followed. What emerged from the investigation was a record of someone who had moved, over an extended period and in relative silence, from online consumption of violent material toward a worked-out plan with a specific target list, a test round fired the night before, and a calculated departure time designed to arrive at a primary school as it opened. The family in flat Leebank Court were not the intended endpoint. They were, in the judge's word, collateral. The final case returns to the beginning, to the winter of 1811, and a question that has never been formally closed: whether John Williams carried out the Ratcliffe Highway killings alone, whether he carried them out at all, and what the city's response to those events tells us about how London has always handled the violence it cannot fully explain. Section 10. The District Superintendent at 63, Tollington Park, Islington. At 6:15 on the morning of September 14, 1911, a 49-year-old spinster named Eliza Mary Barrow lost her life inside a large terraced house at 63 Tollington Park in Islington, North London. She had been a lodger there for just over a year. The household she had moved into belonged to Frederick Henry Seddon, 39, a district superintendent with the London and Manchester Industrial Assurance Company. Seddon lived at the property with his wife Margaret, their 5 children, and his elderly father. It was, by every outward measure, a respectable Edwardian household. Eliza Barrow, who was described by contemporaries as eccentric and difficult, had arrived in July 1910 with a ward, a young boy named Ernest Grant, and assets amounting to approximately £4,000 in cash, gold, stocks and property. By the morning she lost her life, every one of those assets had passed to Seddon. Seddon was born in Liverpool on 21st January 1872. He was a Freemason, a meticulous bookkeeper, and by the accounts of colleagues and neighbours, an energetic and pompous man with an intense preoccupation with money. Within months of Barrow moving into 63 Tollington Park, he had persuaded her to transfer her entire financial estate to him in exchange for a guaranteed annuity of £3 per week. The arrangement gave her security in theory and gave Seddon everything she owned in practice. It also meant that every week she remained alive cost him £3 he considered his own. The annuity became the motive. The logic was precise and, from Seddon's perspective, financially obvious. In August 1911, the Seddons and Barrow travelled together to Southend for a holiday. Shortly after their return, Seddon's daughter Maggie was sent to a local chemist to purchase a threepenny packet of arsenical flypaper. Barrow soon began experiencing severe stomach pains, vomiting and diarrhoea. A local doctor was called and prescribed bismuth and morphine. He visited again on September 9th. Barrow refused to be admitted to hospital. On 13th of September, bedridden and visibly deteriorating, she dictated a will. Seddon wrote it. It was witnessed by members of his own family. It named Seddon as executor. The following morning, she was gone. Seddon then visited the doctor and obtained a death certificate, without the doctor having attended the body. He arranged a burial the following day, September 15th, in an unmarked pauper's grave at Islington Cemetery, despite Barrow's family having an existing vault in the same borough. The funeral was arranged and conducted so quickly that Barrow's relatives, including her cousin Frank Vonderay, were not informed until it was complete. When Vonderay inquired about the estate and was told that all of Barrow's assets had been absorbed into funeral and care expenses, he contacted the police. Barrow's body was exhumed on November 15, 1911. The post-mortem was conducted by Home Office pathologist Bernard Spilsbury, then early in what would become a defining career in British forensic medicine, assisted by senior analyst Sir William Wilcox. The body was found to be unusually well preserved, a condition associated with arsenic exposure, which acts as a tissue preservative. Examination revealed acute arsenical poisoning as the cause of death, with approximately 2 grains of arsenic identified in the tissue. The prosecution's argument at trial was that arsenical flypaper had been soaked in water to extract the compound, which was then administered to Barrow in small doses through her prescribed beef juice and barley water over the course of her illness. Frederick and Margaret Seddon were both arrested and charged with murder. Their trial opened at the Old Bailey in March 1912, with Attorney General Sir Rufus Isaacs leading the prosecution. The evidence assembled against Frederick Seddon was circumstantial but densely layered. The flypaper purchase, the timing of the illness, the will dictated in his handwriting, the rushed burial in an unmarked grave, the transfer of all assets completed before Barrow's death, and the arsenic identified in her remains. Margaret Seddon was acquitted. Frederick Seddon was convicted. At the moment of sentencing, in an act that has entered the record of the case as one of its stranger details, Seddon turned to the judge and invoked their shared membership of the Freemasons, declaring before what he called the great architect of the universe that he was innocent. The judge, Mr. Justice Bucknell, reportedly had tears running down his face as he replied that their brotherhood did not encourage crime and proceeded to pass the death sentence. Seddon was hanged at Pentonville Prison on the 18th of April 1912 at the age of 40. His waxwork effigy was subsequently installed in Madame Tussauds' Chamber of Horrors, where it remained on display for several decades. What the 10 cases in this series share, across 2 centuries, and across the full range of motive, method and setting, is the ordinariness of the threshold. A linen draper's shop in Wapping, a dinner invitation in Bermondsey, a lodger's bedroom in Islington, a cellar in Holloway, a farmhouse in Essex, a family home in Heston, a park in Wembley, a front door in Bushey, a flat in Luton. The violence in each case did not arrive from outside the recognisable world. It came through a door that someone had opened in a place where the people inside had every reason to feel safe. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.